Central European Studies here at the University of Alberta. And I'd like to welcome you to our discussion, our question and period with Dr. Wolf Gruner. Dr. Gruner recorded earlier today the 18th annual Toby and Saul Reichert Holocaust Lecture. So I hope you've had the opportunity to watch this. It's about a 45-minute long presentation, and it's available through a link on our website at the Worth Institute, as well as through YouTube. So if you didn't have a chance to watch it before tonight's discussion, I hope you'll have a chance to watch it afterwards. The format for tonight is that we're basically going to be answering questions and talking with Dr. Gruner about this presentation and about his research on the Holocaust. Well, in order to do that, we'd like to ask you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you go to the bottom of your screen while you're watching this, you'll see it says Q&A. You can click on that, and then you can type in your questions. We will then answer those questions, or I'll talk with Dr. Gruner about those individual questions. This is scheduled to go on for approximately an hour, and we hope to be able to answer as many questions as possible. Before we start our question and answer with Dr. Gruner, I do want to respectfully acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on territory delineated by Treaty 6, 1876. Treaty 6 is a territory, it's a traditional meeting place and home for many First Nations and Métis people. I also want to tell you a little bit about the Reichert Lecture that you heard delivered today by Dr. Gruner. The Reichert Lecture is a lecture which has been going on now for, as I said, 18 years. This year will mark the 18th such lecture presented by the Worth Institute. This campus and community-wide public lecture is made possible by the support of the broader Edmonton community, as well as Mr. Saul and Mrs. Toby Reichert, after whom the lecture series is named. And I hope that the Reicherts are with us this evening. I heard there's a possibility that they may be watching from Ontario. And if you're here, Toby and Saul, I'd very much like to say hello and thank you again for all of your generosity associated with this lecture series. Saul Reichert was born in Pabianice, Poland. He was 9 years old at the outbreak of World War II. Following the German occupation of their hometown, Saul's family home, business, and possessions were plundered, and they were forced to resettle in the Łódź ghetto. From there, they were eventually shipped to the notorious Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. Upon arriving here, Saul was separated from his mother and sister and never saw them again. Saul managed to survive and was liberated by US troops in May of 1945. The Reicherts regard the Worth Institute's lecture series as a way of keeping knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust alive among future generations of students, not only serving the purpose of commemorating the tragedy, but also as a cautionary epistle against such monumental injustices perpetrated on the innocent. The lecture itself, the lecture series, is administered by a committee comprised of members of the community and of the university. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the members of that committee for their participation in the organization and selection of this year, the organization of the lecture and the selection of this year's speaker, particularly, of course, Jillian Horwitz, Eric Schloss, Leon Kagan, and my colleague from the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta, Dennis Sweeney. Finally, the thanks also always go out whenever we have a Worth Institute event to our staff, Rochelle Wright, who is organizing and doing the administration, our communications specialist, and the head administrator of the Institute, Sylvia Krobach. So thank you both for all that you always do for the Worth Institute. Now let me introduce our speaker, who you've already heard. You've already heard him talk. You've heard him discuss for some time his research, but I should mention to you a little bit of background so you know a little bit more about Dr. Gruner. He holds the Shapell-Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and is professor of history at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. He's the founding director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research, which he's led since 2014. And I think you saw in the lecture some evidence from that Shoah Foundation Center. He's a specialist on the history of the Holocaust and in comparative genocide studies. He received his PhD in history and habilitated in 2006 from the Technical University of Berlin. He's been a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, as well as the Women's Christian University in Tokyo and the Center for Jewish Studies in Berlin-Brandenburg. And he was a visiting professor at Webster University in St. Louis. He's the author of 10 books on the Holocaust. His most recent one, The Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia, Czech Initiatives, German Policies, Jewish Responses, was originally published in German and came out in English in 2019. It has also been published in Czech, came out this year in Czech, 2019 in Czech, and is forthcoming or may already have recently appeared in Hebrew this year. He's appointed member of the Academic Committee of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, Executive Committee, a member of the Executive Committee of the Consortium of Higher Education Centers of Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies, the International Academic Advisory Board of the Center for the Research on the Holocaust in Germany, at Yad Vashem's International Institute for Holocaust Research in Jerusalem, and the International Advisory Board of the Journal of Genocide Research. He's currently working on a manuscript dealing with forgotten acts of individual defiance, protest, and resistance of German and Austrian Jews during the Holocaust. And that's what he's been talking about with us today, or that's what he gave the lecture about, and that's what we'll be able to discuss more. So, all of that being said, please, all of you out there, welcome with me, Dr. Wolf Gruner. And I don't know, Dr. Gruner, if you'd like to say any introductory comments before we turn to the questions and answers.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you to you and the Worth Institute for giving me the honor to help this year's annual Holocaust lecture. And I also want to thank the donors of this annual lecture, Toby and Saul Reichert, for enabling this kind of virtual meeting. Unfortunately, I couldn't travel, so but thanks really for inviting me. This was really a pleasure to do this.
Okay, well, let's turn to the question and answer now. I think there's one question to start off. And remember, everybody out there, feel free to bring in as many questions as you want. We're here for an hour, and Dr. Gruner has agreed to answer as many questions as possible. So feel free to type in. So the first one, do you have any examples of successful actions? That is, actions for which the participants were not incarcerated or killed? I guess this is based upon the examples you gave in your lecture today. Most of them seem like they didn't turn out so well for the people who were involved.
Yeah, so I mean, I would not say that a success is actually a measurement for kind of defining what these really courageous people did. Maybe I can rephrase this in saying those who escaped without being caught, which is kind of a different way to say it. And yes, there were some, but interestingly, when you do research in the archives, only those show up who were denounced, who left traces because there was a Gestapo arrest or there was a trial. But as I said in my lecture, I used also Shoah Foundation testimonies. That means video testimonies done in the 1990s by the US Shoah Foundation. And in those interviews, some kind of instances come up where Jews defied the Nazis, and they were never denounced, they never were arrested, they just got away with it. And for example, there's one story, if I might share this, which is really funny in a way, because the outcome was also great. So there was a family who had to give up their shop, which was in the same house as their kind of home. And the new owner of this Aryanized shop, who took over, a non-Jewish German, he was very anti-Jewish. And since the family still lived in the same house, he put a sign at the entrance saying in German, "For Jews forbidden." And the mother of the family one night got out, kind of changed one letter from an in German it's a U to an E, and then suddenly the sign said "For everybody forbidden." A day later, many people, the Gestapo came, the mayor, there were interrogations with the family, but the family stood firm and said, we have nothing to do with it, we have no idea what this was. They even kind of interrogated, I think the son of the family was 8 or 9 years old. So they tried to put pressure on him that he kind of reveals that somebody from the family, but he also stood firm. So never ever came out who changed this sign. And he then later told the story, the 8-year-old son, in his video testimony of the Shoah Foundation.
Juden and Jeden, yeah, the difference to one letter makes a big difference sometimes. Well, you also have an anecdote, or there's an interview there with another girl, right? The story about how she was going to be hit, and she just walked through all the other kids who were hitting her, and then she stabbed the guy, and she obviously survived. You're right to point out this is an issue of sources. So obviously testimonies are from people who survived. But that was the case of another person who showed resistance, right, and survived.
Yeah, I mean, she was later arrested. I mean, she escaped for 2 days. Or several days she hid in the monastery, and then when she came out of the monastery and went back to her retraining camp, where the stormtroopers kind of had devastated everything and beat up all the people, all the kind of adolescents, including her. And then this was the moment where she then got arrested. But as I said in my lecture, she was one of these very courageous people who actually committed several acts of defiance. So she escaped from this arrest, and then another one, and then she made it out to England. And so, but I think what actually is even more important is that there is this really unknown figure of acts which we never will know about, because these people still perished. They were still kind of murdered. So there is not even the chance that somebody can talk about it later. So there is this big unknown, and what I want to do with my work, and for those who didn't kind of had the chance to listen to the lecture, what I try to do is really to broaden our perspective, what resistance means. And normally we think about armed resistance, organized groups in the underground. But what I look at is our individual acts. That means from people speaking up in public, criticizing the Nazi and the persecution of the Jews, to physical self-defense, as just described by Joe Petridge, as this young 16-year-old, 5'1" woman kind of defended herself with a jiu-jitsu trick and stabbed a stormtrooper. So the range is huge, and I think there's a lot what I will present in my book of stories which are really often unbelievable, but really impressive. And but on the other hand, also it shows a certain normalcy. Why would Jews not resist? Is actually my question.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting issue too, just about the kinds of sources one uses. You use both the criminal records and these testimonies to balance them off, because I mean, I often talk with my students about the problem with using criminal sources is it makes everybody look like criminals, right? Because the only people you find are the ones who showed up in the criminal records, and that's going to miss a lot of people, I guess.
Yeah, but there's even among some scholars, there is a kind of a dominating opinion. You shouldn't, when you look at perpetrator sources, you have no chance to actually talk about the victims because their voices is in a way silenced. I kind of twist this around because a lot of the sources I use are actually perpetrator sources, and they reveal in a way these unknown actions of the Jews in Germany and in Austria. So I think what I think the best way is to look at all sources and then make up your judgment.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Well, you talk at the end of your presentation about how it's also about agency, returning agency to the victims, because I think so much Holocaust research is just about the people involved as if they had no say in what was going on or had no influence on what's going on. And so this whole image of cattle cars almost converts the victims into just these passive animal-like things, or even the images of piles of bodies, or remove us from them as individuals, right? And replace them make them as people without any kind of agency, and how to return agency to the people of the past is an ongoing discussion, I would guess. So let's see, we have another question here. Well, this is an important question that I think makes for good discussion. What first piqued your interest in studying the Holocaust?
So there are several kind of answers to this question. One is and they have all to do with my where I'm actually coming from and how I grew up. So as you probably noticed from my accent, I'm German originally, but I grew up behind the Iron Curtain. So I'm actually brought up in communist Germany, and this is what I think is the experience I had in a dictatorship. Don't have many scholars, and I think this is what really influenced my personal perspective, how people react in dictatorships in these oppressive circumstances. So this is kind of one very important element. But how I came to this topic was, it's really a personal story. So my first love was half Vietnamese and half German. And with her, when we went out, when I was 18, 19, she received a lot of slurs, racist slurs against her. And I started to read about where is racism coming from, what are the reasons for it, why are people racist? And at the time, the only explanation was that racism needs to be or is the effect or the result of a state-sponsored ideology. But there was a problem because East Germany, as a communist country, was quite the opposite of racist in their public propaganda, because the propaganda was aiming at equality of all people. It was workers of the whole world unite from Asia, from everywhere. So there was this disconnect between, on the one hand, there's propaganda by the state saying everybody's equal, and then on the ground you have people acting very racist against people who look different. So I said, if books can't really tell me or explain this to me, then I have to find out by myself what are the reasons for racism. So this was my motivation. At the time, I was actually an artist, writer, and worked in a printing shop, then to actually study history, which was when I was 24 or so. And with the only incentive or aim really to find out where is racism coming from. And as a German, my obvious example was the Holocaust. And that's practically how everything started. And yeah.
Well, there is some study now, right, about the difference between the way people in the Eastern Germany remembered and understand the Holocaust versus Western Germany, and the two memory cultures that developed in those two places. So I guess you're coming at it from a particular perspective with the experience in the German Democratic Republic.
But then also, if I can add, what
Sure.
also is important is it was not just this beginning which led me to study the Holocaust, but then doing when I dove in, made a deep dive into Holocaust studies as my PhD, I realized that certain individual personal experiences I had conflicted with the general narrative of the top-down dictatorship, like everything was decided by Hitler or in Berlin. And my experience of a dictatorship, which is not comparable to the Nazis, but still is a dictatorship, I was very different, because what I learned in my life was that dictatorships always depend on the population. You can never rule against the population. And so there was much more participation, enabling among, let's say, the population in East Germany for this dictatorship. And this is these perspectives, which also included, then I was part of the cultural underground in East Germany, where I also saw the variety of how to resist against the dictatorship. This informed a little bit how I started to look at the development of the persecution of the Jews in Nazi Germany and how Jews reacted towards it. And this kind of, not that my experiences explained it, but they led me to look at other sources, to have an open mind, what people do, why are people doing this? So that's kind of a little bit of a different approach.
Well, you have the opportunity to see after the Wende what happened to the people who were the ones helping support the system. They almost disappear in some ways. Nobody was a supporter of the system, but of course that can't be true. You're right. A totalitarian regime can't exist without the support of at least a substantial portion of the people, I would think. So I have another question here. Let's see. This is somebody who said she hasn't heard your lecture yet, but how many of the people who are resisting or did these dangerous deeds are in the avenue of the righteous? I guess that's, well, yeah, I'll let you answer the question.
So my lecture was not about non-Jewish Germans who helped Jews or kind of resisted in other ways. My lecture was really focusing on Jewish resistance. And that means since Yad Vashem doesn't recognize Jewish rescuers, which is kind of up for discussion, because in Israel there's an organization, Jews Helping Jews, because we always underestimate how many Jews individually resisted by actually helping other Jews. For example, a good friend of mine here in Los Angeles is from Poland. He escaped from the Lodz ghetto and was in several labor camps. He himself, at one point, helped 7 other Jews to survive. So these are stories which are seldom told and should not be neglected. But the righteous are reserved for non-Jewish helpers. But I want to say that with my focus on Jews, nevertheless, in these records of for example, court records and police records, I also found a tremendous amount of, I have to say both. On the one hand, participation of ordinary Germans in the violence, but on the other hand, also many more Germans actually helping, showing solidarity, getting arrested for publicly speaking out against the persecution. So there is much more kind of bandwidth, so to speak, from the perpetrator side, but also how people, non-Jewish Germans, resisted.
See here, there's a relatively long question here, but I'll read it in the extent of it. Could you elaborate a bit more on the sources you used in your research? I recall from the lecture mention primarily of diaries and police records. Were there others? If so, please elaborate on those too, and forgive me for not recalling them. So, 2 questions. 1, were these sources that others looked at but glossed over? Or that were they sought out by you and mostly ignored by others? That's 1. And 2, what is your primary methodology for interpreting sources? You mentioned that you first thought some of these records were inventions meant to justify punishment. Were inventions meant to justify punishment. At what point and how did you begin to change how you interpret these sources? So 2 different questions there. About sources.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this question. So the previous research on Jewish resistance used mainly administrative records like Gestapo reports and SS reports. And this is where sometimes these kind of tropes came up, like impudent Jews, which I kind of, with my colleagues, we always thought these are just kind of put in as a pretext to justify harsher measures. What I didn't say in the lecture is that practically by coincidence, I came across these other sources which reveal so much, and sometimes actually also only a little. So I was, before I moved to Los Angeles in 2008, I went to the Berlin City Archive because I knew from a previous research that they have one set of sources serious Holocaust researchers have never looked at. And this was kind of a set of police diaries, police logbooks from Berlin police precincts. That means where the ordinary policeman is writing in, today I arrested XYZ for stealing a bicycle, right? These logbooks survived in Berlin for 30 of the precincts, out of 300 precincts. So when since I knew that they existed, I thought at some point when I have time, I want to go straight systematically through them and see how and if the persecution of the Jews is reflected in these police diaries. So before I moved, I took some 2 or 3 months off and said, this is the time to really go through them. And you have to imagine, these are kind of logbooks with different handwritings. They are very difficult to read. It takes a lot of time. The entries are usually half a page long, sometimes a page, all these different handwritings because different officers are on duty. And so I went through them, and suddenly the first kind of note popped up saying arrest of a Jew who spoke out against the persecution. And I never came across before something like this. And at the point when I looked at these logbooks, I had already 20 years of Holocaust research on my shoulders. So I was an experienced researcher, and I was really I used a lot of different sources. I looked at different aspects of the Holocaust, especially in Germany and Austria, but I never came across one of these records. And this is what piqued my interest. And then I started to go through all these logbooks, and I found dozens other also comments about arrests of Jews for, they called it public incidents. And then I thought, what did they do with these Jews when they arrest them? And I found out that they would try them in court. So sometimes we have the public has a very simplistic understanding that most Jews, when they did something, they would be put in a concentration camp. But that's not the reality, because still Nazi Germany perceived itself as a kind of a legal state. So when somebody kind of would commit a crime, he would put on trial. And this is what happened with these Jews who criticized the regime. So they were kind of tried in special courts. And these special courts were supposed to quell any kind of political opposition. And so these were my main records, the police records, logbooks, but also other kind of files of the local police, plus these special courts records, which I then later found out they didn't only exist in Berlin, they existed in all big cities and even for the countryside. So there is a huge amount of material available, which never really was looked at for the persecution or the resistance of Jews. They were perceived only to be valid for political opposition, like communists or social democrats. So these were the huge kind of new source base available to me suddenly. And then I added the video testimonies of the Shoah Foundation, which also were never really looked at for this kind of individual resistance.
You mentioned that there's a variety of places you went. Did you see much difference? The main examples were from Berlin, but you gave also examples from Vienna. You were in Hamburg, Frankfurt am Main, Munich, Dresden. I was particularly interested in the examples from Vienna. Vienna is an exception in some ways because it's only under the Nazi regime since 1938, as opposed to the other places which had 5 years earlier or started 5 years earlier. Is there a regional difference in the police reports that you saw?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't really see a regional difference, and it is really surprising because it also goes against a little bit our previous understanding, which kind of try to understand the lack of resistance, the alleged lack of resistance, by thinking about that the persecution was gradually, and that means people adapted, and that's why there was not so much resistance, because the Nazis did step by step more radical, or implemented step by step more radical persecution. And then what you just mentioned, Vienna would be kind of the outlier, because in a way, Jews had not much time there when they were kind of annexed in 1938, which would speak that Jews would be much more kind of able to express kind of critique much more than in Berlin or in Frankfurt after all this time. But I didn't actually see this. What I can say is what I found were certain spikes of criticism where Jews publicly spoke out. And this was usually when there was, and this is interesting, either anti-Jewish measures, they protested them directly against, or international crisis. So for example, the spike of Jewish protest in 1938 is not when Austria was annexed. It was when there was the possibility of a war against the because of the Sudeten region. In
Czechoslovakia, with potentially with the war with Czechoslovakia.
Exactly, in the fall of 1938. So suddenly this crisis, political crisis, there was also an economic crisis, but this crisis seemed to have a kind of emboldened more Jews to publicly speak up. But not only more Jews, but also non-Jews, actually, at the same time. So the fear of war kind of brought up much more courage among the Jewish population there.
Interesting. Well, we're getting many questions now as we're talking. People are thinking about things, which is good. Let's see what the next one is. What do you consider as resistance? Do you refer to picking up arms only or other ways of resistance? Please refer to them if you think there were other ways to resist the Nazis and their collaborators. And I think that's a big part of your presentation, right? You have a whole slide at the beginning defining with a new definition of resistance. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but it is part of the argument, right? That so many people have looked only at formal resistance, armed resistance, and this is an attempt to, I would say, broaden the lens. But what do you mean by resistance?
Yeah, so so I try to redefine and broaden up the definition of resistance from kind of our original understanding, which most historians share, which is kind of the group organized and armed resistance. And what I did is actually I used the definition by Yehuda Bauer, which is kind of really accepted by most historians, and added just the word individual, which then kind of came out that any individual or group act against the plans of the Nazis, their actions or their intentions, is perceived as resistance. And I'm doing this, and here's kind of comes my personal experience into play, because it doesn't matter what we think resistance is. It doesn't matter what the perpetrators think resistance is. And the Jews were tried and punished with jail sentences because they spoke up, even in the privacy of their kind of home. When they were denounced. So when the Nazis thought that this is endangering their kind of policies or their society and punish these people, then this is good for me enough to say this is resistance. So in the end, which seems difficult to grasp, in the end, 3 words could actually bring somebody into jail in Nazi Germany. And that's why I perceive these 3 words as a resistance when they were consciously kind of issued or expressed as a critique of the persecution or Hitler or the Nazi regime in general.
Well, just to give an example of this kind of broader definition of resistance for the people who saw the poster that was presented for today's lecture, if you remember that poster, there's a picked photograph of a woman sitting on a bench. The bench says, Nur für Aryer, right? Only for Aryans. And it's a Jewish woman having her photograph taken on this bench, which Dr. Gruner then defines as resistance, right? And I think you said in your lecture, there are 3 levels of resistance reflected in that one picture.
Yeah, because then she smuggled the negative out of when she emigrated. So she was on a bench which she was not supposed to sit on. She let somebody take a picture, which was also forbidden, and then she smuggled out the negative, and that's why it is today at the Holocaust Museum. But I would say to just what I forgot to mention, the different forms of individual resistance which go beyond kind of organized and armed resistance. So in my book, which I just finished the first draft of the manuscript, I kind of try to boil it down to 5 different types of individual resistance. One is written critique or protest. The next one is oral protest or verbal protest. This third one is the kind of defiance of Nazi laws and measures. Then the one is a physical self-defense. And the last one is the destruction of Nazi propaganda signs, Nazi posters, so anything against Nazi propaganda.
Like the scraping of the streetcar symbol,
the swastika on the public bus, or for example, ripping out signs with saying Jews are forbidden here, or including, this would be what I mentioned at the beginning, this kind of changing the letter from a U to an E. This would also be part of this, and so the kind of fighting against anti-Jewish propaganda, anti-Jewish ideology there.
Okay, let's see what the next question is. Thanks for a wonderful lecture. What challenges or impasses, if any, did you encounter while researching this topic? Challenges or impasses? I guess all historians have those times, right?
So many, I can say. More, it was, and I have to reveal, maybe you got this a little bit when I talked about the police logbooks. This research took more than 12 years to kind of first pursue, then to kind of really to analyze the sources, and then finally to write the manuscript. So that's not a short-term thing. And it was especially difficult when we think about the sources, because when I started with the police logbooks, the problem was the police logbooks entries were only half a page long. So they would say the name, they would give you the birth date, but then sometimes not even the profession of the person who was arrested. What they would do is they would give you the reason why they were arrested, and this was where I could figure out, oh, they actually spoke up against the Nazis, because they usually cite a phrase of in these police logbooks. But then it was hard for me to pin these people down, because I had no addresses, I had nothing more than a birth date and a name. So sometimes I could verify these people because of the work of the German Federal Archive, which has this memory book for whole Germany. So sometimes you can find people there with the date of birth, but only if they perished. If they got out, you can't find them there. So this was one problem. Very short notes. Then in the court records, a similar problem. First of all, not all of the court records have survived. It's similar to the logbooks. The logbooks only exist in Berlin. I went to all these other cities, Vienna. Nobody has any logbooks like the one in Berlin. They never survived. But these court records, there are more than these police records, but often only part of the original kind of amount. So, for example, in Berlin, out of 10,000 trials in the special court of Berlin, only 2,000 survived. More complicated is that not only 2,000 survived, but these 2,000 usually are files where you have either an indictment, which is usually 1 page long, 2 pages long, or you have a judgment, which is maybe 3 pages long. Very rarely you have a whole file with Gestapo interrogation, other kind of witness testimonies. So most of them were very short. They gave me a little bit more kind of more material to work with. So now I had often the profession, I had also mentioning of witnesses. There was more in-depth detail about the actual act of resistance. But, and I could actually also see how this played out when there was a judgment. So how many times did they have to serve in a prison, or where they might be, where their acquittals, which was not possible when I had only the indictment. So this was another problem which I faced, and this was also a problem to write my book, because what I do in the book is I try to tell 5 stories, each representative for one type of resistance, and to get a full story to tell, it was you need more material than 2 pages of an indictment, and so it was complicated, and that's why it took so long. But I'm pretty confident that with the amount of research I have done in so many archives, I can make a really strong case to reassess what Jewish resistance is, how we should think about it, and also how to integrate it actually into our Holocaust narrative.
Thank you. I can sympathize with the handwriting. For example, I work in the 16th century. That handwriting is crazy, and they haven't figured out how to spell. There's no standardization of spelling, so add that to the challenge. Is there any negative reaction to your research among the general student body at USC? Interesting. Is there any negative reaction to your research among the students at the University of Southern California?
That's an interesting question. I have to say I'm very privileged. The majority of my students are very interested in the topic, so they are coming out of interest. So I had never any negative kind of comments or anything. The only thing is when I have big lecture classes on the Holocaust, then you have more students who might not be kind of super interested because it's a requirement to do general education elements. But no, I have to say I'm a really privileged person in this regard as a teacher, because most of my students are heavily interested in the topic. They like to do research on their own, because I try to really, in my smaller seminars, to teach them how to do research, and they do amazing things using the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation. So actually, I see practically the opposite, which doesn't mean, I mean, if we go beyond into the broader public, I faced certain negative comments. For example, I published an article in The Conversation about my most recent research about the forgotten destruction of Jewish homes during Kristallnacht. And there I got, on the website, I got really nasty comments. So, I mean, but not at USC. I'm really, I have to say, this is a very pleasant teaching experience I have so far.
Well, actually, that brings up another set of sources that you didn't really talk about when you were talking about the sources. You have police records and you have the personal accounts, the testimonies, but you also have a lot of photography, right? The camera as witness is something that comes up a number of times, at least in your presentation. I mentioned the woman on the bench in Vienna, but you just brought up the images of the Kristallnacht destruction and the interiors of the different houses. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the photography, the use of photographs as evidence.
Yeah, so I would say during the last 15 years, there is kind of more acceptance of looking at photographs also as sources, not just as illustrations, which historians used to do. So when I started my PhD, I was always interested in photography, and I always tried to find unpublished photographs. And in a way, I realized when I did my PhD on Jewish forced labor, and I didn't expect it to find actually photographs of the forced labor outside of concentration camps, but then I did. And so now with every research project I'm going for, I'm always, one of my side avenues is to look for photographs. And when I started looking, they didn't come up in big numbers, but they existed. So for example, in the US Holocaust Museum in Washington, DC, I went to the photo archive and asked them about photographs which kind of reflect Jewish resistance. And they said, we have nothing except like Poland, a little bit about the uprisings, but nothing really. And then when I kind of try to tell them how I see resistance, what I kind of think about potential photographs, then they started to come up with a few photographs, which, for example, document where Jews documented the assault on their homes during Kristallnacht. This is one. But then there are also others, like, for example, the woman on the bench. So I think systematic digging and kind of insistence and kind of, I would say, kind of in a way, an informed insistence yields results in the end. And I think in my book, I use actually photographs in a kind of way, because the book is aimed at a broader public. So I use much more photographs than I usually do. I was able to find photographs of the people I talk about, which is great, which I also didn't expect in the beginning when I started the research and the writing for the book. But I also kind of make a larger argument about how Jews reacted to the persecution. And interestingly, one kind of really imagery which kind of emerges is that Jews took private pictures where they stand in front of kind of slogans against them. So, for example, there is a photograph of a Jewish family in 1935 where Nazis had put a graffiti on the gate of their house against Jews. So what they did was not to just clean it up. Before they did, they actually took a picture and they stand in front of it, a little bit like Lizzie Rosenfeld on this park bench. They have an attitude where you see in the picture, this is not what you can do with us. I mean, this is not so easy. So we don't give up so easily. So you see a very kind of resilient attitude in these photographs. And so that's interesting that this comes up along the way.
I very much like the way you read these photographs and use them, as you say, not just for documentation, but also to try to think about the mind of the photographer and what does the act of photography mean? I mean, maybe we can understand that a little bit more now with the rise of cell phone footage and how photographing and videoing things has become an active part of resistance or so. But you're even projecting that back into the 1930s or 40s, how the act of photographing something can be seen as an act of resistance.
And I have to say, to just make the kind of bring this point home, this was not like my own idea. Actually, the police records told me this, because in the police logbooks in Berlin, I found several arrests of Jewish and non-Jewish Germans documenting the atrocities during Kristallnacht. So the vandalism of shops and so on. So when they were arrested for doing this, so this was my thinking, then this is perceived by the Nazis as something as resistance, right?
Makes sense to me, yeah. Okay, so let's see what the next question is. Well, this might actually speak to you less as the historian related to this particular topic and more in your position as a director of a genocide center. But from your perspective, do you think the world is becoming more fascist? What do you think about the rise, the number of conspiracy theorists in the United States? It's a pretty broad question.
Yeah, I mean,
or two questions.
Yeah, I think there is definitely kind of a tendency, and we see this in Europe, we see this in Latin America, that there is a trend towards authoritarianism, definitely. And I think everybody needs to really kind of confront this trend and to work against this. And this is, by the way, what my hidden message, or not so hidden message actually, for my book will be, is if Jews were able to resist against the Nazis in a larger scale, then everybody can resist and should resist against any kind of development towards authoritarianism, everywhere and anywhere. And there is no excuse for not doing and saying, well, I can't really do something. There's no excuse after, I think, we acknowledge what individual ordinary Jews did during the Nazi period. So there's nothing necessary like a big organization or a huge kind of uprising. We can do, everybody can do something on a small scale.
Which I guess includes rebutting conspiracy theories or so.
Exactly. And by the way, there is this, what on the one hand is really problematic, because social media enable a lot of these conspiracy theories, the kind of also authoritarian propaganda, but also social media provide us with a tool against it. So there's kind of a very ambivalent kind of judgment about social media. So on the one hand, they enable many people to put comments on stuff and everything, but on the other hand, we can also work against this.
A questioner wants to know about outbreaks. I guess you're not really studying the breakouts from the camps and things. Were there other successful outbreaks besides the one at Sobibor?
So, I mean, in general, there were several uprisings and outbreaks like Sobibor, Treblinka, the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz kind of rebelled. There were ghetto uprisings on a larger scale. We had partisans. So if you look for armed resistance and organized resistance, there's still plenty more than we usually acknowledge. But I didn't look so much at this scale. What I was interested in is the individual resistance. But even there, I mentioned in passing that one of my protagonists escaped from several arrests. This is in a way also like an outbreak, right? If you break out from a jail or from a transport. And there's also more interesting new research, not my own, but other colleagues who are really doing fantastic work. For example, there's a dissertation, which is now, I think, even published in English, where a colleague of mine investigated and found out that Jews actually jumped off deportation trains, and not just one or two, by the hundreds. So she looked at sources from the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France, and she found several hundred cases where Jews kind of jumped off from trains, and that's how they survived. So, and I can just confirm this in a way, because when I did my PhD, which was not on resistance or anything, I was really browsing widely through archives, because there were no sources, direct sources for Jewish forced labor. So I had to go a long mile to find in other institutions kind of letter exchanges with labor offices. And one day I came across this Gestapo circular where the Gestapo in 1942 advised the German railroad that they have to check every train the planks on the floor, because Jews are usually kind of losing them to break out. That's kind of also what we don't usually think about when kind of the mass deportations are mentioned, and you, Joe, mentioned this in the beginning, that people have the idea that they were just kind of deported like sheep to the slaughter. But if you think about the Gestapo circular ordering the German railroad to check every train with for loosened planks, tells a different story.
Very much, yeah. At what stage of the Shoah were the Jews put on trial for voicing their opinion?
That's a good question, because this was very surprising for me too. Usually we thought, first of all, there would be more kind of resistance in the beginning than later, because we had this idea of the adaptation. Second of all, there was more oppression the more time went on. But interesting is that actually there is not much of a difference between the 1930s and the 1940s. So even during the war, we have people speaking out in public against the persecution, people ignoring, neglecting, or fighting against Nazi laws, either general national laws, local restrictions. So there is a kind of, we can't really say that there is less than in the beginning. The only thing what I want to kind of repeat is you have certain spikes, and these spikes are kind of 1938 in the fall, with first starting with the Sudeten and then the Kristallnacht. Later, then you have the beginning of the war with the spike. Then you have the mass deportations also with the spike, when the mass deportations start. So there is a direct reaction towards certain towards more oppression or certain circumstances. But in general, it is not that we have less than in the beginning. That was for me an amazing kind of outcome from the research.
Well, thank you for your insightful comments on your research. Recently, we've witnessed an upsurge in Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion on the right and left side of the political spectrum. How do you counter Holocaust distortion in your work and research? What do you think are the best strategies to prevent the spread of Holocaust distortion?
Yeah, the problem is, I mean, this is a wide kind of area, because it is kind of the ranges from outright denial to very sophisticated kind of distortion, which is in itself a form of denial, but a more sophisticated one. And that's really problematic. And there are really certain kind of right-wing, university educated people who are kind of promoting these kind of distortions of Holocaust history. Then sometimes also, I think what is also problematic is that we often have we have to blame ourselves, that we have this kind of often very simplistic view of what happened, which is much easier, I think, to deny than when we have a more complex understanding what actually happened during this time, who was participating. If we acknowledge, and this is practically the result of my research, but research from a lot of kind of recent generations of scholars, is that so many more people kind of participated in the Holocaust than we ever assumed. That means Germans, but also people like indigenous populations in occupied and annexed territories. Then it is much harder to deny what actually happened, because you can't just blame just one fraction of the German people like the Nazi Party or the Gestapo. So it's much harder to deny. And I think the more we explore and find out about the complexity, what happened, the harder it is to deny. But it's also in the public realm to kind of draw comparisons to or make people aware of potential comparisons, similarities, and then also to just put out potential when we see some denial or distortion, to call it out. And sometimes it is even, you have to call out those who are kind of made in the best minds. Yeah, so sometimes even people, well-minded people, distort the history of the Holocaust, and I think we always have to speak up against this.
Well, I think unfortunately we're coming to the end of our hour. With your permission, I'll ask one final question here, but though again, it's a pretty broad one, so we may just be able to touch upon it. But we have a question. I'm hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on the role of women in the various resistance movements, as well as women's individual acts of resistance in Germany, especially as a proportion of the overall resistance activities. Jewish women in Poland and other states east of Germany were quite active in the resistance movements and activities, especially women who were involved in socialist, communist, or Zionist youth movements. Were Jewish women in Germany collectively mobilizing this way as well?
So since I didn't look so much in organization, but what I know is there was participation of Jews, men and women, in kind of in left-wing communist or social democrat resistance groups. So for example, the woman we mentioned who stabbed the stormtroopers, she was actually doing some work for a communist underground group earlier in Berlin. So there was this, but there was also kind of resistance in a negative way by the communist groups, because they felt that the Jews would endanger their work, because they were practically endangered twice, for being Jewish and for being resistors. And this kind of was often kind of led to rejection of these of Jews who were, or the total separation. So one testimony talks about that there was a group of 3 Jews making explosives for a communist group, but they never had contact with the group. They were only kind of with an intermediary. When we talk about women, from my work, I can only say that many women actually resisted in all these variety of ways. And I have exactly the same number as men, so there's no difference. And I think what the problem here is that often women are written out of history, that they are neglected what they do, because especially when we think about resistance, often they are perceived as not doing the important work, which when I teach this, I totally try to kind of really erase this idea, because when you think about armed resistance, when there is the need for arms, who is bringing the arms? It's usually the women, because they are not kind of at kind of street blockades. When the Nazis look for people, they look for men, not for women. So women did all these kind of courier messenger services, bringing food, bringing arms. Without them, nobody could have done the armed resistance if they would have not kind of provided the arms, right? So this is kind of, I think, a failure from the sides of many historians to write them, to neglect what women did. And in my work, I see women as equally able, equally willing to kind of publicly protest the regime, to defy Nazi laws, and even physically defending themselves.
Well, I'm afraid, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our hour. I bet we could go on for longer, but thank you, everybody, for all of your questions. I think we got through most of them. I appreciate the time you took to think about these questions, and thank you, Dr. Gruner, for answering them. I would be remiss if I didn't mention to everyone that this is the first of a number of events that we have that are connected up with what we call Jewish Studies Week. There's going to be another Jewish Studies Week actually in March that I want to mention to you. But this week on Thursday at 5 p.m. Mountain Time, 19th November, we're going to be having a live lecture by Sarah Imhoff of Indiana University. The title of her lecture is An Unlikely Zionist, Jesse Sumter, Judaism and Disability. And if you'd like to find out more information about that lecture, you can go to the Worth Institute website. And we actually just put on the bottom from Worth Institute, everybody click here to register. So there's a link here. Thank you, Rochelle, for the link to that site. As I mentioned, also in next term, in winter term, we're going to have a series of events, which we'll probably call something like Jewish Studies Week 2. This is in conjunction with Dr. Peter Sabo, the Bellsberg Lecturer in Jewish Studies here at the University of Alberta, who I'm happy to announce recently joined the Worth Academic Advisory Board. So he's one of our newest members of our Academic Advisory Board. Dr. Sabo will be inviting another speaker to come in March. We'll have our annual Tova Yedlin lecture on Jewish history also in March. And this year's Central European Art History lecture will be based on a Jewish topic. So keep an eye out for further information, time, dates about the Jewish Studies Week this week as it continues on Thursday, and the Jewish Studies Week in March. Okay, well, that's the advertisement or the announcements about upcoming things. Now, Dr. Gruner, I'd like to turn to you to just say thank you very much from all of us here at the Worth Institute for both your lecture that you prepared and for your thoughtful comments to all these questions, the answers to all these questions. I look forward to reading the book. I hope we get more information about it when it comes out. And yeah, we'll have to stay in touch as future developments come up, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity, your institute and the Worth Institute, to collaborate further in the future.
Yeah, that sounds very good, and I thought about the same. So let's keep in touch. Thanks again for having me, and thanks for to everybody who kind of joined the Q&A. And so the questions were really great, and I appreciated very much your interest in my research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Good night. See you at the next event. Bye.